So, hello everyone. Glad you could make it today for our Collective Empowerment, Collective Liberation Academy series of webinars. As Virginia said today, we're going to be addressing how to serve victims who are deaf and hard of hearing, and also how to be better advocates for those who have disabilities. So, we're glad you could be on today. This is our last set of webinars for our series, and we're looking forward to finishing up our work with you, and we will be sending out some more information regarding how we want to end our time with you. So I'm not going to prolong because I really want to hear what Carrie and Kim have to say today. So with no more prolonging, let's see what Carrie has to say today for victims who are deaf or hard of hearing. Thank you, Carrie.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today. So I'll give you just a little bit of background information about myself. I've been in the field of domestic violence and sexual violence for over 20 years. The agency that I established in Vermont is a statewide agency, and we provide service to individuals who have hearing loss. These could be deaf folks, hard of hearing people, late deaf and deafblind. Anyone who has hearing loss is the population that we can serve. My main role is training, giving presentations, doing systems advocacy. I do have two advocates who are culturally deaf, one in the north and one in the southern part of the state. And they work one-on-one with individuals, clients, if you will, who need advocacy, whether it's at the hospital, the police station, the emergency room, or in the courthouse. And they work on a per diem basis. That is the system that we currently run on. So that's just a very short, sweet background, who I am, and the agency that I work for. And we also have a wonderful interpreter today. Her name is Corey Bruner, and she is going to provide voice interpretation for me. So if you have any questions, she can interpret those questions, and I'm happy to respond. Okay, so the next slide, please. It's a little weird. So the picture's in the middle, but it's not supposed to be, that's okay. So we're talking about definitions, and I on purpose misspelled definitions because I can, because I'm the presenter. So when we talk about deaf folks, deaf people, you sometimes use a capital D deaf. These are people who consider themselves a cultural and linguistic minority. They use American Sign Language. They may come from a family of generational deaf people. American Sign Language is their primary language. Likely they attended a residential school for the deaf, and they like to socialize with other culturally deaf people. So like I said, American Sign Language is usually their primary language, their first language. So deaf-blind people often have different levels of hearing loss and different levels of vision loss. So it could be somebody who has complete loss of hearing and vision, or somebody who has tunnel vision and is considered hard of hearing, or somebody who has complete deafness but cannot see at all. So it really does vary, this group of people, and they have a very different communication methodology than culturally American Sign Language users. So if somebody is profoundly visually impaired and deaf, they might use tactile communication, or they may require you to stand very close to them so that they can see you from a very narrow field of vision. There's also another group called hard of hearing people, and these are folks who rely on hearing aids. They will use their residual hearing. They will rely on lip reading. They often can talk and choose to use their voice to communicate. Some may sign and some may not. And some can hear pretty well and some not. So again, this is a group of a population of people for whom hearing loss really varies. I want to talk a little bit about the term hearing impaired. This is a pathological view, a medical view, if you will, of deaf people. And many people in the deaf and hard of hearing community do not appreciate that word. It is not acceptable. It is actually considered very offensive. It has a very negative connotation. So if you would like to refer to an individual who is deaf or hard of hearing in a more culturally sensitive way, you can use deaf and hard of hearing, or a person with a hearing loss instead of hearing impaired. So, you know, deaf people have jobs and families, they have PhDs, they have, they have licenses. The only thing that they cannot do is hear. And so they really do not consider themselves a group of people for who has an impairment. Late deafened can happen in two ways. So it can happen where an individual is driving home from work, they get into a car accident, it's really bad, they wake up at the hospital and they have completely lost their ability to hear. It could also be an allergic reaction to medication, surgery related, head trauma. So regardless of the reason, they become completely deaf very rapidly. So these are people who often grew up not knowing anything about sign language, not knowing anything about the deaf community. And for them, this hearing loss is a really horrible experience. There's a lot of divorce, depression, and sadness about losing their hearing. Typically, these people don't know American Sign Language. So it's a group that really struggles with their inability to hear and with communication. The last group you'll see is age-related hearing loss. And some of you may have parents or grandparents or, who are getting a little bit older. My dad's 75. He's in denial that he has a hearing problem, but he does have a hearing problem. So a lot of older people who just over a long period of time have started to lose their hearing because of their age. They're not considered hard of hearing. People who've had hearing loss for most of their lives, and they're not late deafened because they still have some ability to hear. They're just losing their hearing, and they don't sign, and they usually rely on assistive technology like hearing aids and lip reading, that kind of thing. Next slide, please. So I'd like to focus a little bit on the different groups that I just spoke about and how the best way to communicate with them. For deaf people, American Sign Language is the best way. It is not a universal language. So if I go to Australia and I try to sign with deaf Australians, I will not understand them. This is the same for any country in Europe. American Sign Language is here in the US. American Sign Language has its own grammar, its own syntax, sentence structure. It is a completely different language than that of written or spoken English. It is a visual language, and there is no written form, and I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. So American Sign Language is based on handshakes, facial expression, body language, gestural communication. All of that is what is encompassed to make American Sign Language a language. So folks who are culturally deaf, who went to a deaf school, for whom American Sign Language is their primary language, for communication purposes, your best bet is to procure an American Sign Language interpreter. Next slide, please. So there are other ways to communicate. So most late deafened and hard of hearing people will communicate using lip reading. And lip reading sometimes can be really hard. So to be clear, only about 30% of what's being said on the mouth is understood by lip reading. 70% is guesswork. So it's really hard to lip read, especially if you don't know the topic or the context, you don't know what's going on, if the situation is confusing or stressful, it is really easy to get confused. And a lot of words look the exact same, and so misunderstandings can often happen. I do have an activity I typically do specifically related to this activity, and I'll do part of it. I won't collect the answers because it will be too hard to wait for you all to raise your hand, but I'm going to show you an example of how many words can look the same and how it can be easily misunderstood. So I'm going to say 3 things. And you're going to see how similar these things look on my lips. Okay, you ready? So everybody look at me. So I'm not going to ask for the answers right now, but I will tell you that I said the first one was maybe, the second one was baby, and the third one was pay me. But if you are trying to lip read somebody, it looks completely identical. So it is really hard to understand lip reading if you don't have context. And again, it just goes back to a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding. And some people are very skilled lip readers and some people are not. I grew up sitting in front of the class, learning and being trained to lip read. And so I'm very, very good at it. But other people may have never had that opportunity. And they just may not be skilled lip readers. It depends on their family dynamics, where they went to school, what kind of educational methodology they grew up with. So it's really important that you do not ask a deaf person if they lip read. Don't ask them that, because you're going to get a bad response. It's offensive. So if you really want, if you meet a deaf person and you want to know how they communicate, you can get a piece of paper and say, how is the best way to communicate with you? And then they will tell you, I need an interpreter, I can lip read, we should write back and forth. They'll answer that question for you. So keep it an open-ended question. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about writing a little bit. So for some culturally deaf American Sign Language users, English is really difficult. If American Sign Language is their first language, it then means that written English is considered a second language. So this would be the same thing as if somebody came from another country to the United States and they learned English as a second language. It's going to be harder for them to read and write English. So sometimes when deaf people write, the structure of the sentence is not in a traditional English structure, and this can cause some communication misunderstandings. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about barriers. There are some barriers that many people don't think about when they're considering working with individuals who are deaf and hard of hearing. And of course, communication is one. Physical is another one. This could be related to your job, to the criminal justice system. So the two main examples that come to mind for me, if you're in a domestic violence shelter, many shelters are locked and they have an intercom system as a way to get into the shelter. And this does not work for deaf people because we cannot hear. So we don't know if we push the intercom system, we don't know if somebody's answering and we don't know how to respond. Another example of a barrier could be at a police station. And again, it depends on your hometown and what your police station looks like. But sometimes they have, like you go into the lobby and you have to pick up a phone to talk to someone to say what it is that you want. And again, for deaf people, this does not work. Other times you'll go into the police station and they have that glass window that you have to talk through. And so it is very, very difficult for deaf people to communicate through that glass window. So those are a couple of physical barriers that are things, that you may not consider when you're working with individuals who are deaf. Other barriers for deaf and hard of hearing people could be attitudinal. And this is not an intentional attitudinal shift. It might be your first time meeting a deaf person. You might be nervous, you might be anxious. You want to make sure that you're providing the best services. But that attitude of nervousness and fear is shown on your body. And deaf people are visual people, and they will certainly pick up on it. And that nervousness will give deaf people pause and can impact the relationship that you have with the individual that you're trying to serve. So my hope is that from this PowerPoint and from this presentation, you'll have a little bit of comfort with knowledge and a little bit of background information, that you'll feel you can work with a deaf person, and that you'll really make sure that your attitude is, not that of somebody who's so nervous. And it's, it's okay to say you don't know, and to just ask the deaf person or the hard of hearing person what the best way is to communicate with them. So a little bit of other educational information. This could be websites, there's flyers, brochures, you know, any materials that you have for your agency that you're providing for your services, that you send out to the community about what it is that you're hosting, if there's an event or a specific occasion. For deaf people to be able to read it, remember, like I said, some deaf people do not have proficiency in English. They don't read English the way other adults read English. So there's been a lot of research that says deaf people, many deaf people, have the educational level of about 4th grade. So going back to your flyers, your websites, your events that you're putting out to the community, if it is not written in a way that deaf people can understand it, they will not have access to that information. So if you're doing a PSA or doing some kind of a radio advertisement for deaf and hard of hearing people, because they don't listen to the radio, they will have a barrier of access to information about your organization. Next slide, please. There are some unique barriers within the deaf community as well. The deaf community, by and large, has its own hierarchy. So there's deaf people in power, and deaf victims often do not feel safe to look for help within their own community because of the fact that the person that could be victimizing them might be in a position of power. There's always fear within the deaf community that the person of power will be believed and they will not be. And within the deaf community, there is a core group of culturally deaf people who are from deaf families. So these are folks who are genetically deaf, they have a history of deafness, their parents are deaf, their grandparents are deaf, the aunts and uncles are deaf. So for those people, they are considered kind of the core of the nucleus of the deaf community. Deaf people who are born to non-deaf families, to what's called hearing families, are not considered as powerful or as reputable in the community. So there is a hierarchy of deaf power within any deaf community. There's also little or no education about domestic violence in the deaf community. It could be that they didn't have access to it because they were not at a school for deaf or not provided interpreters during their educational during their education. It could be that they did not attend sex ed classes. They may not have any information about what domestic violence or sexual violence looks like. So 90% of deaf people come from families who are not deaf. And so sometimes these deaf kids grow up and they don't have a lot of communication with their family members. And for them, either as the victim or as the abuser, they may not understand anything about domestic violence. They may blame the victim for the behavior if they themselves were abused. And within the deaf community, there is some substantial isolation. Deaf communities are communities that are typically pretty small, except for a few populations of large deaf communities in larger cities. So if you have a deaf person who's living in a rural state or a rural area, like here in Vermont, there's some places in Vermont where we don't even have an internet connection. This is considerably worse for deaf victims because they cannot access services and they cannot access communication. And there's lack of accessible, competent services. So certainly your organization wants to provide the right services, but you may not have a list of interpreters, you may not have the appropriate assistive technology or equipment that's needed, which is not your fault. You just need more information. You need some technical assistance. But often that information is really valuable information. And sometimes a deaf victim will elect not to go for help because they don't believe that you have systems in place to give them what they need to be able to access your services. And just going back to isolation, deaf victims sometimes prefer to stay in a battered relationship, an abused relationship, because the person that is abusing them is also deaf. And if they go to a domestic violence agency, there will be nobody to communicate with them. So just something to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So when you talk about deaf children and deaf adults, there is a lot of fear about the residential schools for the deaf closing. So historically, deaf people went to residential schools for the deaf, and lately many of them have been forced to close because of sexual assault within the school system, specifically the residential school system for the deaf. So sometimes deaf children will experience molestation or sexual abuse, and they will not say anything for fear that they will feel like they're the one closing the school. And for many deaf people, the residential school for the deaf is the hub of deaf culture and language and activities and socialization. So there is fear that these schools will close if something like a sexual scandal happened in the school. Deaf people are by and large perceived as more vulnerable, and they are often an easy target because of that communication barrier. And even worse, if you have a deaf person that has come to the United States from another country who may not know American Sign Language, they are an even easier target and even more vulnerable to be taken advantage of. Within the deaf community, there are, the grapevine, the rumor mill is very, very large and very profound. These communities are very, very small, and so rumors start and spread very quickly. So it is really hard for a deaf victim to feel safe going to a friend's house because everybody knows where everybody lives. And if the deaf victim says something, there is a high likelihood that it will be found out, and then the abuser may go to the person's house where the victim may be hiding. There's also often false arrests, and the arrest is on the victim. So if you have a deaf wife and a husband who can hear, there's a 911 domestic violence call, the police show up, who are they going to talk to, right? They're going to go right over to the hearing husband, and the hearing husband is going to take advantage of his hearing privilege and have a conversation with the police officer. He's going to talk negatively about his deaf wife who has no access to communication or what he's saying, and he is going to blame her for the incident, and she may get arrested. Next slide, please. There's a few examples of power and control for deaf and hard of hearing individuals that might be a little bit unique than the typical power and control we often talk about in these situations. So let's say if you have a hearing husband and a deaf wife, they may take away their equipment, they may break their equipment so they're not able to communicate with the outside world. They may actually physically break their hands or fingers so they cannot use American Sign Language. The hearing husband may refuse to sign to the wife so that she cannot have a conversation with her husband. They may hit the ears. They may hit the head with blunt objects, and they will also play head games on them, maybe manipulating their hearing aids or assistive listening devices, like turning them up or turning them down, shutting them off, to make it more confusing for the deaf victim. Next slide, please. In some situations, the hearing husband would force the deaf woman to use her voice and try to speak as opposed to using American Sign Language. He may forbid sign language in the house so that the children don't have access to communicating with their mom. By not being able to use American Sign Language, he may make the individual feel like they are less than human and can use that against them with the children. Your mom is an unfit parent because she can't hear, she can't communicate with you. They will also make fun of their speech and humiliate them if they're being forced to talk. They will use their deafness or their speech in court as a weapon against them. They'll say, I'm the hearing dad. I can hear them crying at night. She cannot. They don't know how to use American Sign Language. I can speak English with them. The equipment is never working. For what it's worth, there's a lot of technology out there that allows a deaf mom to hear her baby crying at night. Next slide, please. So there are some other additional mind games that victims will have to suffer the consequences of. One is called gaslighting. So this might think that the victim might think that they're hearing something, or that they cannot hear something. And this goes back to the example of playing with their hearing aids. They may turn the volume up or turn the volume down. They may manipulate the hearing aid so that it does not work effectively. Some hearing aids have a remote, and so you can turn the volume up or down even if the person has the device on their ear. And again, the ease of being able to communicate with a police officer when somebody shows up at the house, because the abuser can hear and speak. They certainly will cut them off from the deaf community. They will not let them use video phone technology or webcam technology to communicate with other deaf community members. And this obviously makes isolation worse. And then there will always be the threat of taking away children because the individual is deaf or hard of hearing. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk a little bit about interpreters. The role of the interpreter is really as a two-way street of communication. So often people will come up to me and say, oh, you're deaf, do you need an interpreter? And my response is always like, no, I don't need the interpreter, you need the interpreter. So really the interpreter is there for both of us. It's not just for the individual who is deaf, it's also for the individual who can hear, because you can't communicate to me without an interpreter and I can't communicate to you without an interpreter. So it is really a two-way street. The role of the interpreter is to be objective, will not have an opinion, they will not tell you what to do, they facilitate language communication. They follow a national standard. They have specific guidelines they must follow and a code of professional conduct they must adhere to. This code of ethics has several tenets, one of which is confidentiality. And they have to follow these tenets or rules. And one of the biggest ones is confidentiality. They do not share information. So today I'm here with Corey and she's interpreting for me in the office. We're done at 3 o'clock. She's gonna go home to her husband and say, hey, I saw Carrie darling. She did a wonderful job with her presentation. No, she absolutely will not do that. She cannot speak to what she interpreted, how she interpreted, when she interpreted, or the nature of the interpretation. That is part of her job. Next slide, please. The interpreter is going to interpret everything they hear. Everything that is in the environment will be interpreted. So if the interpreter hears a dog barking, they're going to let the deaf person know there's a dog barking. If there's a baby crying, they will let the deaf person know there's a baby crying. If there are 2 people talking in the hallway, the interpreter will let the deaf person know. That is their job. They interpret environmental information that a hearing person likely would hear. So they provide equal access in that respect. That is part of their job. You cannot ask an interpreter not to interpret something. If you do not want the interpreter to interpret something, leave the room, go to a place where she cannot hear you. The interpreter will also take on the personality and the mood of the person involved. So if a deaf person is very angry, the interpreter's tone will reflect anger. If a police officer is angry, the interpreter will sign in a way that conveys anger to the deaf person. The interpreter is not angry. It's somebody within the interaction that is angry. And you know, if people are happy, the interpreter will take on that characteristic of what happiness looks like in either language. Their job is to facilitate communication accurately, and as clearly as possible. They do make mistakes. Sometimes they really screw up, but they do the best that they can. And it also depends on who the deaf person is, their skill level with American Sign Language, the situation, a variety of other factors. Next slide, please. So always have the interpreter across from the deaf person. So today is a perfect example. I'm sitting at a table and the interpreter is right across from me. She's 1 foot away from me. So this way I can see her. It doesn't make sense to have Corey sitting next to me because then we can't really see each other. And that's very confusing. So have the interpreter across from you. Always try to have good lighting so that we can see each other clearly. If we can't see each other, we won't be able to see facial expression, we won't be able to see finger spelling, signs might be difficult to understand. So just make sure you have clear lighting. And when you talk to a deaf person, look at the deaf person and speak directly to the deaf person. Do not say, tell her, tell him. Just speak directly to the deaf person in first person. Make sure that you always give yourself a little extra time to allow for questions. You know, if the deaf person is signing, you have to remember that American Sign Language is not like English, and it actually is a much more efficient language. So it's going to take the interpreter a little bit longer to put something, to render something into English. So you'll see that I'm done signing and she's still talking because it does take a little bit longer. So even though I've stopped signing, you need to wait until the interpreter has finished speaking, and then you can respond to the deaf person. So that is really the best way to have communication be fully accessible. And speak at a normal pace and a normal volume. The interpreter can hear perfectly fine. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to scream for the interpreter. She can hear you. And you always want to check to make sure the deaf person understands what's going on. And the reason I say that is because deaf people have a tendency, how do I explain this? So the interpreter will be rendering into American Sign Language, and a deaf person will watch and nod their head like this. This does not mean that I'm agreeing with something. It does not mean that I am saying yes. It just means that I'm following the conversation. I'm following the interpreter. So do not make the assumption that the deaf person is clearly understanding or that they're agreeing to something just because their head is nodding. Sometimes you might see one interpreter and sometimes you may see two interpreters. There is a national standard, a rule of thumb, if you will, that if anything is above 2 hours, it requires 2 interpreters. If something is 1 hour, usually 1 interpreter is okay. But that highly varies on context, how many people are involved, subject matter, familiarity with the subject. A lot of factors will help to determine if you need 1 or 2 interpreters. Next slide, please. So a certified deaf interpreter, hang on 1 second. So somebody just asked a question. Is it appropriate to announce that an ASL interpreter is in the room at the beginning of a presentation, so people are aware of their pace? You certainly can do that, sure. Sure. So let's talk a little bit about a certified deaf interpreter. I'm assuming most of you have not worked with a certified deaf interpreter. This is an individual who is deaf or hard of hearing, who has native or near native fluency in the language. They are highly skilled and highly trained in a variety of settings. They have an exceptional knowledge of deafness. They really understand the frustrations and barriers of being a deaf person, being a linguistic and cultural minority. They really understand the culture and the community. They just get it in a way non-native signers don't get it. So a certified deaf interpreter is used in situations where you have a deaf person who may have a second disability. They might be a deaf person that is having a mental health crisis or mental breakdown. It could be that the interpreter may not have the appropriate skill, and they want to relax their eyes and they want to look at a culturally deaf person or a native deaf person sign. This does not mean that the certified interpreter is not highly skilled. Often they are highly skilled. They just may not have the ability to match the language in the most effective way for the deaf client. Next slide, please. So you might be wondering who pays for the interpreter. It really depends on where the deaf person is. If the deaf person goes into the hospital is responsible for paying for the interpreter. If the deaf person goes into your domestic violence agency, you are responsible for paying for the interpreter. Into the police station is responsible. The deaf person should never pay for interpreting services. It depends on where they go. Wherever they are physically present using interpreting services, that is the agency that is responsible for paying for the interpreter. I think I'm missing a slide, but let's go to the next slide and see what it says. So hold there for just a second. I just want to do a little bit of additional clarifying. There is a difference between a certified interpreter and an individual who knows sign language. Sometimes people may have taken an ASL class, maybe a couple ASL classes, maybe they have an aunt who's deaf or a family member who's deaf. They do not have a national credential. They are not formally trained as interpreters. They are not required by their certification to follow the code of ethics. They do not have to adhere to confidentiality. They do not have to make sure that they are the appropriate fit for a given situation. Those are called signers. Certified interpreters are credentialed interpreters who have been trained in deaf culture, deaf community, American Sign Language, the process of interpreting. There's a big difference between the two. You should not be using a signer for legal situations, for meetings, for conversations with a deaf victim. And certified interpreters have specialties. There are some interpreters who are nationally credentialed, who do a lot of medical interpreting. That is really their purview. There are other interpreters for whom legal interpreting is their purview. Some interpreters have an additional credential that allows them to work in legal settings. It's a specialized credential in legal, SCL is what it's called. So if you're in the courtroom with a deaf person, you should really try to procure a legally credentialed interpreter. They are incredibly hard to find. In the state of Vermont, we have none. We have 2 interpreters who have some legal experience. They've gotten through a lot of training, but they are not credentialed in that additional legal certificate. So it makes it very hard to manage court situations with sign language interpreters, especially when you're looking for legal folks. And I'm pretty sure there's a question that's coming up. Hang on 1 second. Why did the doctor's office? Okay, so a doctor's office is responsible. So either they're making that statement because they don't know that they're supposed to, or they don't want to. This happens all the time. Doctor's offices will sometimes refuse to bring interpreters, and oftentimes doctor's offices will refuse to provide interpreters, and they will tell the deaf person to bring them. And lawyers will often say that they are not responsible for providing interpreters, and they will ask the deaf person to bring an interpreter. If the deaf person asks for an interpreter, by law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that organization or agency or company must provide an interpreter and pay for it. So it could be the doctor's office doesn't know that they're responsible, or maybe they do know and they don't want to. It really depends on the situation. There are other accommodations that can be used, not just interpreters. CART is a really great accommodation for late deafened and hard of hearing folks. It's very similar to what you see in the courtroom with the court stenographer. CART will record everything that's being spoken. It'll talk about what happens in the courtroom with the lawyer, with the judge. So the CART reporter has a microphone that is mic'd into the courtroom. It usually goes to a hearing device for them, and they can type everything that's being said. Different than a CART reporter, court does the exact same thing, only the transcript is also provided on like an iPad or a laptop. So this is great for individuals who can speak, because there wouldn't be a way for them to, if there's no interpreter, if a deaf person wanted to speak, they couldn't speak back if they were using CART. But for a hard of hearing person or a late deafened person, being able to read everything that's being said and then being able to speak a reply is a really great technology. Many hard of hearing and late deafened people don't even know that CART is available, or they know that it is available, but they don't realize that the court is responsible to provide it. So it's always important to get in touch with the court and make sure it is their responsibility, make sure they know that it's their responsibility to procure and pay for a CART person to come in and provide CART in a courtroom situation. Next slide, please. So assistive listening devices, ALDs. These are for folks who often have hearing aids. There's a special switch in the back of their hearing aid that allows them to hear who is speaking directly. So the individual would have like a lapel mic, and it would just increase the sounds directly to their hearing aid. It will help to block background noise. It will help them focus specifically on the individual that is hearing. And it is really great for late deafened and hard of hearing folks. So they'll be able to have a lot better access to what's being spoken. They won't need American Sign Language interpreters, and they can usually speak for themselves. The court, again, is responsible for providing that technology. There is no guarantee that the court will know they need to provide that equipment or how to procure that equipment. In Vermont, they do, because I have gone to every courtroom and told them that, but I don't know what it's like in other states. Next slide, please. I know there's a couple questions coming up. I'm gonna ask you to just hold those questions for half a second. And I know we started late. I think I'm okay for time. So this is a little list of do's and don'ts when communicating with deaf people. So this is what you can do when you don't have an interpreter. There are different ways to get a deaf person's attention. You can certainly wave. You can tap them on the shoulder sometimes. You can pound on a table, stomp on a floor. Deaf people are very sensitive to vibration. You can flick the lights off and on to get their attention. So that's one way to get the attention of a deaf person. Just don't scream. That's not going to help. It's important to maintain eye contact with the deaf person. So just make sure that you are looking at each other all the time. You don't want to start the conversation with somebody and then halfway through it, do this. Or do this. You just want to make sure that you are very clear so that the deaf person can see everything. So make sure you're not chewing food or chewing gum. If you're a man, you absolutely have to shave off your facial hair. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. You don't have to shave off your facial hair. So speak clearly and speak at a normal pace. Do not over enunciate. Are you deaf? Don't do that. Please, please don't over enunciate. Just make sure that the environment is as quiet as possible. If you're in your office and there's a bunch of phones ringing and the copy machine is running, there's a lot of distractions, move over to a private room. Less visual distractions, less auditory distractions will make communication way easier. Next slide, please. If you are writing back and forth, just remember English might be this individual's second language. So just keep in mind the 3 S's: short, sweet, and simple. You know, we're not writing a novel. We're not using very large words, verbose terminology. Just keep it short, sweet, and simple. And if the deaf person does not understand a specific word, rephrase, use a different word. Take advantage of using body language and facial expression to get your message across. And always check to make sure that there's understanding. You'll see this a lot, but they really may not understand anything that you're saying. But they don't want to ask because they're sick of asking, they're embarrassed to ask, they're afraid to ask. So you'll see a lot of this head nodding when really there is no understanding happening. So just check in and make sure that everything is clear. Next slide, please. Please don't position yourself in front of a window or be backlit, because that will cause really bad shadows and it will be very difficult for your face to be seen. If you're changing topics, please make sure you let the person know. So let's say you're in a shelter, a domestic violence shelter, and you're doing an intake form and you're asking about their housing situation. Say, hey, I'm going to ask you some questions about your housing situation. Okay, now I'm going to ask you some questions about your income. Now I'm going to ask you some questions about your children. So cage the questions with a topic before you move on. And again, talk to them. Don't talk to their partner or the other person. Talk directly to the individual who's deaf and hard of hearing. If you want, you can certainly use an iPad or a laptop. You can type back and forth. It's going to depend again on the individual's comfortableness with the English language and competency in English. Next slide, please. So video relay services, called VRS, is the way deaf people use the phone. So they obviously can't pick up a phone and make a phone call, but they do need to call you and you need to call them. So they do that through video relay interpreting. So what you have, the deaf person has in their house is it's almost like a webcam, and they call a call center to where there are interpreters in cubicles all over the country. They're remote interpreters, and they sign to the interpreter that's in this cubicle, and the interpreter makes the call to you. You answer your phone, and you speak to them as if you were talking directly to the deaf person. You reply, the interpreter signs to the deaf person who sees the interpreter on a computer or TV screen. So all you'll need to do is make a phone call. We, the deaf people, have complicated equipment. All you need is just your phone, and you just make a call. And again, these interpreters in these call centers are also certified interpreters who adhere to a professional code of conduct, confidentiality, and all that stuff. Next slide, please. So video remote interpreting is not done on the phone. It is when a deaf person and a hearing person need an interpreter, and the interpreter is not there physically. So if you have in your shelter a deaf victim and you want to have a 10-minute conversation with them, you two sit next to each other, you open up a laptop, and you call the video remote interpreter center, where again, there is a group of interpreters in these cubicles. They pop up on the screen. So the video interpreter will speak and sign and provide interpreting for that conversation as you would a live interpreter, only they are in a remote location. VRI is a paid service. You have to pay for the interpreter because you and the deaf person are in the same room having a conversation. Video remote services, VRS, when you're on the phone with a deaf person, is a free service. You do not have to pay for anything. So it's remote interpreting, but it's two different types of remote interpreting. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, interesting. Okay. Okay, great. So now I'm going to see, okay, I see there's 3 questions. Let me address these questions. I'm just looking at the question regarding the doctor here. So Sumaya, I'm not sure I understand your question. So are doctors required to have a nurse assistant in the examining room in addition to the interpreter? I'm not understanding what you mean.
So there used to be a requirement that a nurse or some other medical staff would be in the room when you're having an exam. I've noticed of late that that is not always the case. And so I'm just wondering about that regarding a deaf person or a hard of hearing person in the examining room for safety reasons, and also just to be able to understand, what the procedure is, especially if it's a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence.
Okay, so one thing, yeah, so there's several things about that question, yes.
Yes.
So in Vermont, interpreters cannot be called to be subpoenaed in court. They cannot testify, they cannot be witnesses for any job that they've provided interpreting services for. In general, the court system should not be calling the interpreter to testify because of the interpreter's code of ethics and confidentiality. So in Vermont, we have actually passed a law that prohibits the judge from calling. So the interpreter cannot be a witness. My understanding is that you do not, at this point, you do not have to have a nurse or other medical professional in the room if the interpreter is there. But if it is a sane exam, typically the interpreter will stand in a very specific place to respect the privacy of the deaf person. And many interpreters have taken training by me to go specifically through the process of a sane examination. And so we often have a deaf advocate with the person in the room, and that person works as an advocate, and the interpreter puts themselves in a place that is the most respectful place possible during the exam. Does that answer your question?
That's fine. Yes. Yes. Clara.
Okay, great. So the other question I see listed here. So so the answer to this question about hospitals being reprimanded if they ask somebody to bring their own interpreter, the answer is no. There is no formal disciplinary system. There's no ADA cop, if you will, to make sure that somebody is providing interpreters. However, you can sue. So the deaf individual can file a lawsuit against the hospital or clinic for not providing interpreting services. And you would use the Americans with Disabilities Act as fodder for that lawsuit. That might go through the Human Rights Commission, that could go through a private lawyer, or if there's a disability law advocacy center, but certainly that has happened. There is no formal system set up. There's nobody watching to make sure that hospitals or clinics provide interpreters, but certainly deaf people can seek litigation. Sometimes all that's required is a little bit of education about what they are supposed to provide under the law. And most of the time, hospitals are pretty good at it. Clinics and private practice doctors' offices are not nearly as good. So that's where you often will find problems. The other question is, if your organization hires a deaf and hard of hearing staff person, are they responsible for hiring the interpreter? And the answer is yes, your organization is responsible. Okay, so I'm done with my presentation unless there are more questions. And if not, then we'll let Kim present. And if a question comes to mind while Kim's presenting, I'm happy to wait till the end to answer it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope this was a good experience for you, and I hope you learned something new. Thank you so much. Take it away, Kim.
Thank you, Carrie. That was great. So how is my volume? Can people hear me and see me? Yes? Did people need to take a break before we get going in the next one?
I think that's a good idea. Maybe a short 3-minute break.
Okay, then I'll see you in a few minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. Kim, can you hear me?
Hello. Things
Kim,
going all right?
yeah, I was trying to check in with you. This is Samaya. I was trying to check in with you, see if you have everything you need.
I think so. I'm
Okay.
good.
All righty.
I got my tea.
Okay. And we're going to let you introduce yourself. Is that correct?
That we are. So is everybody back? Looks like everybody's here. Good. So if you can hear me and see me, that's great. I'm glad that people have monitors turned on so I can see people. I like Carrie's green dew. She's got a photo up. But if there's anybody else that's not calling in but has the video capacity and wants to turn on their screen, then I can see folks, and that makes it fun. So you're encouraged to use the chat bar on the side. If there's anybody new coming, the chat is icon is at the bottom of the screen. You can use that to ask questions of everybody or individuals in the chat box. So I am Kim Brittingham, and I work with WOCN on the National Call to Action Technical Assistance and Training Project as an aspiring ally and as a trainer. And I came when I was first meeting WOCN under their Leadership Academy. I came in as a trainer because I work in the disability rights movement. So for 8 years, I was the state's, and this was in Vermont, where Carrie is, the state's ADA technical assistance provider. So I did a lot of training, and I sat through years of training on the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I'm glad that I get to share some of that with you today. Previous to my work with the Vermont Center for Independent Living as an ADA technical assistance provider, I worked in my 20s as a volunteer for local programs as a volunteer hotline advocate, and in the courtroom and in the DV shelter. And I also had an opportunity to work on an OVW grant that was a collaborative grant that had my disability rights organization working with Carrie Darling with DVOS and with developmental disability advocates and 2 programs in Vermont to increase the accessibility in violence response programs in our area. So this presentation that I have for you is about 11 or 12 slides, so it's not a lot. Any one of these slides I could spend hours talking about because there's so much detail behind it, and how it actually gets implemented well takes time, and it takes support. So I'm sharing with you the things that over the past years of work keep coming up to the top, that keep coming up as things that are issues for people with disabilities when they experience violence. So this is what I have to share with you. And I will ask a couple of questions as we go through, and you can respond in the chat bar. I'm going to keep my eye on it so I can respond to questions as they come up, or you can hold them to the end. So can you hit the next slide? Which is probably me, which I just talked about. So right, let's start with high rates of victimization. Yeah, thank you, Virginia. So for the folks that are here with us today, are you serving victims and survivors with disabilities right now? Just in like yes, no answer in yes from somebody I see in the chat bar. Is there anybody else that's currently serving, supporting a survivor who has a disability in one of their programs? Lynn? Can either one of you be unmuted and share just a little bit about a recent interaction that you've had working with a person with a disability? Oops. Lynn doesn't have a microphone. Okay. How about Werner? Are you able to speak? No, Virginia, if you can unmute people.
It doesn't seem like she has a microphone either.
Oh, okay. I'm reading in the chat bar that, hello, all, my name is Alma Mann from the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I just wanted to share with everyone that we currently share office space with a statewide organization, Deaf Unity, and they are very knowledgeable about working with victims of DVSA and human trafficking. That's great. Good to hear. And I know that programs that collaborate closely with disability-led organizations are successful in serving survivors. Like, collaboration seems to be the key. Thanks for sharing the contact information too. So people with disabilities are victims of violent crimes twice as often as people without disabilities. And I say twice as often, but it's really more frequent than that. The national crime surveys that are put out, like the one here that is on the screen from it's the National Crime Victims Survey from 2016. These statistics reports do not include people with disabilities who are living in facilities, group homes, institutions, or hospitals. And we also know from other statistics that people in those facilities are predated and experience violence at higher rates. And so I just want people to keep that in mind, that when you're quoting numbers or statistics about people with disabilities being victims of crime, they're much, much lower than the actual truth, you know, the actual, what people are experiencing. So people with cognitive disabilities are victimized the most. So when these reports break down statistics and numbers related to types of people that have intellectual disabilities or developmental disabilities are victimized more often than any other group of people with different disabilities. So can you go to the next slide, Virginia? So given the national crime victim numbers, the people that you are seeing in your programs and shelters, many of them have disabilities. If you're not seeing lots of folks with disabilities coming to you for support, this is an underserved group. How we think of people with disabilities, how we define who it is that has a disability. There are a few definitions out there. On your screen right here is how the World Health Organization thinks of and defines disability. They think of disability as a complex phenomena, reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which they live. So really, disability is more about the environment, how accessible the environment is to an individual. So the more accessible the environment is, the less disabled the person will be. So they look at that as something outside of the person. You know, however you're able to communicate, how well you're able to communicate, or how well you're able to move through a space, or how well you're able to think and cognate in a space. Is more or less disabling. Now, in the United States, we have the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the ADA was passed to protect people with disabilities. The definition of disability that we hear most commonly here is the one that the ADA created for us. So under the ADA, a disability is any physical or cognitive impairment that impacts a major life activity. So if you are a person who doesn't hear or doesn't see or doesn't fully hear or fully see, or has impacted thinking, sleeping, walking, procreation, working. If you think of any major life activity and you are a person that because of a physical or mental thing that's going on for you, the inability to do those major life activities, then you are protected by the ADA. It doesn't define you. It doesn't make you who you are, but it protects you. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the World Health Organization thought about disability and how laws define that in order to protect people. So we can move to the next slide on granting accommodations. So that ADA, the Americans with Disability Act, requires programs to provide equal access to its programs and services. I could have said organizations. So organizations, whether you are a nonprofit organization, a government entity, a doctor's office, a restaurant, a business, any place that the public goes has a responsibility to provide equal access to its programs and services and products. So those are all ADA 2 and 3 responsibilities. If you are an employer and you employ more than 15, that's 1-5, more than 15 employees, then you also have responsibilities to the ADA to your employees with disabilities. and that's, you know, ADA Title I. It's not important necessarily that people understand which title they fall under, but the way that accommodations are granted is a little different between an accommodation that a employee is asking of its supervisor, or then a member of the public is asking you in order to receive a service that you're providing. So there are ADA technical assistance like guide sheets that are really useful in granting accommodations. There's a Google Drive that WOCN has, and there are these guides are in there for service animals, granting accommodations, effective communication in meetings. And so it's easy for you to find them. You can always go to ada.gov, which is the government's website, to find any technical assistance materials. There's just a lot of them. I pulled out the ones that would be more useful to you. So it means that granting accommodations for accessible meeting spaces and shelters, welcome care providers and service animals. So when we say welcome care providers, some people with disabilities have individual assistants that that they rely on to get out of bed in the morning, or to go to bed, or to eat, or for transportation. And so if a person is in shelter or coming to an office, then it means welcoming their care providers and their service animals if they have them with them. Means granting reasonable accommodations on request. It is on the shoulders of the person with a disability to ask for the accommodation. You can help them along if you see that you're aware of something that might help them communicate with you, but usually it's on the person with a disability. And then you also need to modify programs when necessary. Modifying a program might be modifying the way a support group is set up to, allow an additional person, like a sign language interpreter to be there when it's a closed group. So if I have another one. I want to know if people have any specific questions about accommodations, because this can be a long, complicated process sometimes. So does anybody have a specific question about reasonable accommodations? I have one more slide for it. So if you have some, chat them, put them in the chat box. We're going to go to the next slide on reasonable accommodations. So we talked about granting accommodations, but reasonable accommodations is a step above. And that's like, how do you determine if an accommodation is reasonable? So here's some examples of reasonable accommodations. Reasonable means it can be provided without an undue burden on the organization providing it, and that it matches the need that the person has, that it's reasonable to the person's need. So additional time for communication that you need, then Carrie was talking about needing additional time to communicate using an interpreter, because we've got a lot of listening and waiting back and forth. Using alternative formats, audio files or large print. Again, these are granted upon request, but if you know that there are large print of some of your materials are requested more commonly than others, you could make them ahead of time and have them on file. Assisted listening devices, as Carrie mentioned, is a form of reasonable accommodation. Captioning your videos. So if you're producing videos for a training or for the public talking about your program, or people telling their stories, you want to make sure that you have those captioned and don't rely on YouTube's auto captioning tool. CART, Carrie also mentioned, that's the real-time interpreting at trainings for people who are hard of hearing. It may benefit them to be able to read everything that is being spoken. And of course, ASL interpreters and video remote interpreting. So before I leave this slide, I'm just looking over here to see if there's any questions. The question that's asking, how can we as an organization do better to provide accommodations for blind individuals for a 2 or 3 day conference? Do you have any resources that one can access to assist us with this? Right. So I am making an assumption that the people that are attending the conference know what accommodations they need, what they're asking for. And if it's specific assistive technology, all states have assistive technology programs and loaner equipment, if it's equipment that you're looking for. So we'd want to know what the accommodation is that they're asking for. Yeah, is the question, is it about money? Is it about money to pay for them, or is it about space? You can either type that in, or we can talk about it more later or offline. But people that are blind and are navigating either with a service dog or with a cane to feel their way through a space, you should pay attention to how you set the space up. So the ADA does have a guide sheet for accessible meetings, and it has a checklist in it. And it goes over how to create accessible routes through meeting areas, and how to deal with tables and not use tablecloths, and how to set up a space that is accessible for people who are blind. So maybe that's helpful. And then to work with a local organization that works with people who are blind to see if they have a consultant that could work with you on planning for the event, I guess is what I would say. So 2 little things I want to say about reasonable accommodation. In employment, a reasonable accommodation is any modification or adjustment to a job that allows an employee to perform the essential job functions. And that is a process that is confidential between the employee and their supervisor. In places the public goes, in offices and somebody that you're serving or supporting or working with, a reasonable accommodation is a modification to a program or a practice that allows a person with a disability to access and enjoy the benefits of that program or service. And as I said in answering that other question, that you can partner with state assistive technology programs for loaner assistive technology, or to have them come in and show you how to use different devices. They do little pop-up workshops at employers' offices, but you just need to Google state assistive technology program and you'll find where they're housed and what they can do for you. Okay. So the next slide we have, I think, is on service animals. So anybody that's with us today seen a service animal in their program? With coworkers, in a shelter? Is anybody working with service animals? Just a yes or no in the chat bar if you want to. For one person saying yes, clients have brought service animals, sometimes from somebody else. Yes, I work in a DVSA shelter. Cool. And so how is that going for people? How is the service animal in the workspace going? Look for answers of like, good, bad, no problem. Oh my gosh. How's it going? One person says it's not been an issue, except it's hard on the animal. Absolutely fine from somebody else. Well, wonderful. Other than the animal having a hard time. I have spent in the past a lot of time training on service animals, like all day trainings on service animals in housing situations. And for some reason, maybe it was, the location where I was living, in Vermont, there's very strong feelings about dogs. I'm not sure, but this topic can take people down a wormhole really quickly. At the bottom of this slide, I put a link to Washington State's guide. So it's the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and they have a model protocol on service animals. So if any of you all want to look at that and download it, that's the one I would recommend. They spent a lot of time there. But just basically what I'll say about a service animal, this definition did change a few years ago when the ADA was updated, but a service animal today is a dog that is trained to perform a specific tasks to support a person with a physical or an emotional disability. So service animals are allowed in public places, in offices, and in shelters. There is no certification required. There is nobody there out there, any government entity that is saying this is a certified dog. I know people carry certifications with them, like that they went through training and all of that, but under the law, they're not required. The animal's care is provided by its owner, and the animal can be removed from your office or the shelter if it poses a threat. But you must allow the person that was using the animal to stay. Does anybody have a specific question around service animal? I'm going to read a question here that says, it seems as though orgs feel that they have done well in asking the question about disability needs on the registration form. I often wonder how many folks are not able to register for events because orgs can't meet their needs. Orgs could also do better in adjusting the standard size font, make it larger in their emails and outgoing docs, handouts on their website, and have a tab to make it larger. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have a couple slides near the end about some best practices around accessibility, and that's definitely in there, increasing your font size and kind of marketing yourselves and your ability to grant accommodations and welcome service animals into your facilities. I have a next slide I'd like to talk to, unless there's any questions about service animals. That kind of surprises me that there isn't another question about allergies to dogs or any of that. So people good on service dogs? If not, you can hold it till the end. I know we're going to have time for questions. So caregiver violence is something that I wanted to touch on here. So Lynn caught my attention. She did say, please say something about allergies. It's often an excuse to not take animals. So this I have heard a lot, and I got a lot of calls around this on the technical assistance line. And people do have allergies to dogs, and it is it's a true thing. It's a problem. The ADA says that needing a service dog trumps a person's allergy. So the service dog needs to be allowed to enter, even if there are other people in the shelter that have allergies. And it's on the shelter staff to come up with creative ways to keep them separate or to do the best in mitigating the problem for the other person, for the person with the allergy. And then there was another question about what's the difference between a service animal and an emotional support animal. So a service animal is a dog that's trained to do a task or tasks to support a person with a disability. Sometimes those tasks are, the dog is trained to put weight against a person that is distressed, to calm them down. So that would be a service dog that is performing tasks as it's trained to do. An emotional support animal has a different definition. It is providing emotional support to a person. So there's different definitions for it. Emotional support animals are allowed in public housing. They're allowed, as an accommodation request in public housing. And they can be cats, they can be, other types of animals. Just like in public housing, a service dog can be a horse now. But an emotional support animal does not meet the definition of a service dog. There's a couple of articles, guide sheets, and they're in that Google Drive that we provided the link to, and the link is at the end. And I'll also email it to you that talks about that intersection. Also talks about therapy animals, because the therapy animal is providing therapy to somebody else, and that's another type of animal. And I say, somebody's saying, thank you, we make accommodations within the buildings, unit, shelter, and keep the animal. Great. Okay. So a little bit about caregiver violence. And I don't know if this topic is familiar to you or not. It's something that came up several times for us with our collaborative grant. When caregiver violence is not intimate partner violence. So there are situations when a care provider, a caregiver, and a caregiver can be somebody's spouse or their domestic partner or a family member. Your care provider could be hired by an agency. It could be a temp that just has shown up one time to work with you. It could be somebody that the state is paying or that you're paying privately. So care providers are personal care attendants or CNAs, certified nurse assistants, or home health folks that come into your home as a person with a disability and provide care for you. So when a care provider is perpetrating violence against a person with a disability, and it is not a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a husband, or a wife, then it doesn't meet the definition of intimate partner violence. So I know people have been turned away from programs because it's not intimate partner violence, it's caregiver violence. And there isn't local support for that person. Additionally, if that care provider is the main provider, the primary provider for that person with a disability who's now experiencing abuse, the person experiencing the abuse may be at risk of institutionalization. If there isn't somebody, a backup person to come to the home and get them in and out of bed to support them in their independent living needs, then they may be going to a hospital or an institution where the risk of violence in their lives increases. So collaborating with a disability rights organization can provide better outcomes, just like collaborating with state assistive technology or a Center for Independent Living to provide assistive technology, can also get support from them in moving through this process. I'm going to talk about, does anybody have a question about caregiver violence before I move on to talking about mandated reporting? Has anybody run into this situation where you have an adult with a disability who's being hurt by their care provider? It's complicated, and it gets complicated because the disability rights organizations, the Centers for Independent Living that you would think would be supportive in this way, are not violence response organizations. They're not skilled to support people with disabilities when they experience violence. So they really need you all. They really need the violence response, programs and providers to work with them. So let's move over to mandated reporting. So as I mentioned on the last slide, talking about loss of independence. So adults with disabilities can lose independence and face hospitalization or institutionalization when a report is made to the state adult protective services. So it's my understanding that all of you all in the work that you do are not mandated reporters. But the Centers for Independent Living, social service providers are mandated reporters. And so it's really important, in my mind, that your local programs are working together with disability organizations to support people with disabilities when a report is made. So these are some best practices here. Let the person with the disability make the report when that is possible. Frequently reports are made and the person with the disability who the report is being made about does not know the report has been made. And so they don't have the time to plan for who's going to come support them for the next shift, or how they're going to be able to remain, in their home. So working with the person and the disability rights organization to plan for their primary care provider, if the abuser is the perpetrator, is really important. Has anybody here on this call done that? Has anybody had a situation where a person with a disability is experiencing violence at the hands of their caregiver? And if that caregiver is gone, they're not going to be able to live in their home? And is that a yes or a no from folks? It may be that you're not seeing it because the disability rights organization, doesn't have a relationship with you and know that you're somebody to call for some help. So. So when I've been, a part of this disability rights movement for several years, and we go to DC for the anniversary of the ADA, the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we have a rally and a parade through the streets up to the White House, and we're chanting in the streets, our homes, not nursing homes. It's it's the chant that's been, I think, since the beginning, and it really sticks with me, how much it takes to live in your own home independently, and how easy it is to be moved into needing to live in an institution. And so this little place of having violence response groups collaborate with Centers for Independent Living is really, really important to me. There's one other thing I'm going to talk about before we kind of go back to access and some best practices on welcoming spaces, and it's around false reporting. So I'm going to ask folks if you're familiar with false reporters, if you're working with false reporting in your community, with victims who false report, or the hospital or the police, or even a program says, well, this is a false reporter. Just a yes or a no. See one no. Another no. Another no. All right. So this is something that we worked on with a hospital in the largest city in Vermont. Because people with, oops, can we move the slide to the false reporting slide? It's the next one. Thank you very much. So this is a situation that seems to reoccur more frequently than I realized when I first started doing this work, and it took me a bit to understand what was happening. So people with developmental disabilities or mental health conditions with traumatic brain injury face additional risks if they face an additional risk of becoming labeled false reporters. And then once they are labeled false reporters, it gets worse. So my understanding or how this happened in this hospital was, an individual would come in and be asking for a sexual assault nurse examiner. They felt that they had just been assaulted, and they would do the same exam and would find no evidence. And so in this situation, the person was being triggered and was triggering a memory that they were living over and over and over again, and in order to get support they were going to the hospital. There can be confusion with people with developmental disability in crisis, communicating, a timeline, or communicating what happened, and it conflicts with the police report maybe. So there's lots of ways that it can happen, but once a hospital sees somebody a few times, and they don't believe them, they call them a false reporter, and then they will turn them away. And so once the hospital knows that, once the police knows that, once the hotline folks know that, that gets out in the community, and that person then becomes like a serial victim, that they're re-victimized by perpetrators because they know that the hospital and the police are not going to believe them. So if this is something that you're seeing, it's another place to get cozy with a local, TBI, traumatic brain injury group, or developmental disability advocacy group with SABE, self-advocates becoming enabled, or with mental health care providers to support folks. Because this is a path that once you're on, it's really hard to get off of. And there's a comment here that says, thank you for addressing false reporters. I have seen this when working with survivors of sexual assault with developmental disabilities. Yeah, yeah. And then once that is out, it's even harder to tell your story because other people in your group just don't believe you either. So I just want to talk about a few more things. We've got 10 minutes left with our time together. So I wanted to talk about the next slide and welcoming spaces, I think. And so going back to the beginning of the presentation where I shared the World Health Organization definition of disability, where disability is determined by how a person interacts with their environment. You know, consider your office spaces and the places where you hold meetings, house individuals and families, and consider, you know, these following things. And this is just a beginning list. So if people have more to add, I'd love to see that pop up in the chat box. But really thinking about your accessible main entrance. You know, people want to come in through the main entrance. You know, it's a pet peeve of people with disabilities to roll in through the back, you know, or to enter through the back. So an accessible, you know, marked main entrance is great. And an accessible main entrance includes, you know, things that Carrie talked about an intercom system that's a video intercom system so that you can see somebody signing as compared to relying on voice. You know, it has a no-step entrance so people can roll through. So, and also thinking about your spaces. And I'm saying these things because these are the top things that just come up over and over again. So open spaces without clutter, without furniture that doesn't need to be there, without, you know, rugs that are throw rugs, things that that create, you know, a kind of an ADA compliant space. There's an ADA checklist. It's called adachecklist.org. And it goes very simply, you know, through a facility, entrance, interiors, bathrooms, all of that. You could just do a checklist through your office and see places that you could improve. You can post assisted technology available signs at your desk. You've talked to your local assistive technology provider, that state AT group, then you'll have a bit of familiarity with what those products are. You know that you can get them on loan when you need them from them. If you just post a sign, then people will be like, you know, they can see themselves there. They can see that their needs are going to be met there. You can print reasonable accommodations granted on your materials, on your meeting agendas, on your brochures. You could add images, icons of the hands, the interpreting hands that you saw in Carrie's presentation, or of the symbol of a wheelchair, of Braille. You could use any of those symbols like on the back of your brochures, because that will show members of the public that you can provide, you know, the accommodations that they are going to need in order to work with you. And then use images of people with disabilities in your marketing, in your videos that are captioned. And consider implementing a low or no fragrance policy if that isn't something that you've already done. There's a whole groups of people where fragrances are an issue, not just about immune systems, but about sensory situations. Does anybody have anything to add to that list that you have found makes your space more welcoming for people with disabilities? I would say hiring people with disabilities. You know, when you come into a place and you see people that look like you and sound like you and act like you, you're much more likely to feel like you can work there, or be a part of what they have to offer. And then, so I'm not seeing any other suggestions from the group yet. They can still come. My last slide is a resources slide. And I'm going to ask between here and talking about resources. If anybody has questions at all about anything that I brought up, if there's anything that didn't quite sound right, think you misheard me, or you were like, oh, I hope she covers this on this webinar and she didn't even talk about it. I see in the chat, there is a keeping up with the maintenance of ramps. Signs for accessible parking sometimes need to be repainted. Yeah, especially if they're not covered or you're in a heavy weather area, those things do deteriorate. Yep, and ramps need to be, you know, smooth and stable and slip-free surfaces in order for them to meet ADA compliance. I would say too that you should have a fund, you know, a line item in your annual budget for meeting accessibility needs, because it is just a part of doing business. So you having a line item in your granting accommodations, you know, section around hiring sign language interpreters, as you would for language interpreters. You could have a line item for maintenance of the building, and inside that maintenance, make sure there's something for maintaining accessible elements. So anything else people want to add? The resources that I have to share with you all, WOCN has a guide of cultural competency and sensitivities for allies in the anti-violence against women movement. There's a link to it on WOCN's site that I've posted there that I think is super useful if you haven't read that one yet. I put NCIL on here. NCIL is the National Council on Independent Living. So all states have centers for independent living. They are disability rights organizations. They are employed, made up of, the board is full of people with disabilities, or providing direct peer support to other people with disabilities in the community. It's not a daycare facility or an adult day program, even though it says it's a center for independent living. So it's the disability rights movement. It's the folks that have brought you curb ramps and brought you the ADA and made accessibility that we have real. So you can go to nickel.org and you can find your local CILs. And then Safe Space of Texas I put in here because they have a lot of good materials, and they have for several years. They've done a lot of work around accessibility of programs and services. So if you haven't seen them, I recommend them. And again, ada.gov, I said that several times, and it was throughout the publication, or throughout the presentation in these slides, because it's easy to remember, ada.gov, but they do have good resources there. And the ADA network, which you can just Google, can provide you with direct ADA technical assistance providers no matter where you are in the country. So right up at 2:58, any last questions for me? You can email me.
Kim, thank you so much for the presentation. It was great, very informative, and I think it will be very helpful to organizations who are trying to improve their services to survivors and to just people in general who contact them, and also to in hiring persons with disabilities and advocating for persons with disabilities. So thank you very much. We appreciate you, and we appreciate Carrie for today's presentations. Thank you.
I just want to say that I'm available to any of you at any time. You can call me. I could happily call into like 15 minutes of any staff meeting and just do Q&A if you have questions around what I talked about or working with people with disabilities, or I could connect you with the local folks that could come in and do that for you.
That would be great. Thank you, Kim, for your services. Also, too, I want to make a correction. I think I said that this was the last presentation in our series, and it's not.
Right.
It's not. We have one more, Carew Pick and Lynn Peters. Some of you have worked with Lynn and Carew. They've been with us for a while, and they're going to do a presentation on shared leadership on September the 12th. 1 to 3 p.m. and you will receive a notice again from Virginia about that presentation and the link to access for the presentation. You can make sure that you share that with your staff and your board, the people who work with you in community on NCTAP. So we look forward to seeing you again on September the 12th. This has been great. Thank you for your participation. And we're not going to hold you because we're trying to do something on time. We're going to end on time. Thanks a lot, people. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.